Welcome to the Nightclub, guys. It's your host, the Night Wrencher. A few days ago, I made a video comparing the older early 60s Mopar big block heads, and I compared it to the late 70s Mopar big block head. And then after that, I compared them to the even newer 440 Source Stealth head, which is essentially a factory big block casting with just a couple of upgrades that we went through. After I finished that video and posted it, I came to the realization that I was building not only a big block Mopar engine, but I was building a LS engine at the same time. So I thought it was a great idea to compare the latest iteration of the 440 head, which was a 452 casting, and comparing that to the early LS heads to see exactly what was learned in the 20 years that this head ended and this head began. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Quickly looking this over, you'll notice something very obvious right away, and that is that the big block heads actually have larger valves than the LS heads. The big block heads measure in at a 208 intake valve and a 1.8 exhaust valve. The LS valves measure in at 1.6 exhaust valve and 1.9 intake valve. The 1.6 exhaust valve is very similar to the older big block heads, but the 1.9 intake valve is almost 200,000 smaller than the big block. Not only that, behind those valves you'll notice the valve springs, and if you just take a quick glance at them, you'll notice that the 440 springs are not only taller, but they're wider as well. The big block valve springs measure in at 2.5 inches high, whereas the LS springs measure in at 2.1, and the diameter of the big block springs measure in at 1.4 inches, whereas the LS springs measure in at 1.2. If we look at the valves themselves, you'll also notice something very obvious, and that is that the LS stems are significantly smaller than the valve stems on the 440. With larger valve stems, you tend to have more stable opening and closing events, and you're also able to run larger valves easier. If we look at the valve spring retainers, they tend to follow the same thing. The LS spring retainers on the right are significantly smaller as well when compared to the big block retainers on the left. Believe it or not, the intake and exhaust ports on the LS head and 440 heads measured in very similar. Although the ports themselves were a different shape, the overall area of the port came out very similar. Keeping all of that information in mind, you would assume that the 440 head not only flows more than the LS head, but actually makes more power. The reality is that even though the big block head has all of these upgrades over the LS head suffers from the size, but it does not suffer in the flow rates. Before I started filming this video, I went ahead and I did an extensive amount of research to see what the average flow rates were for the stock 452 castings and the stock 706 heads. What I found was overall throughout the late 60s all the way to the late 70s, the overall casting didn't change too much. Flow numbers stayed relatively the same, with the average difference of about 10 CFM. When we looked at the 706 heads, which are not only the smallest heads but also the lowest flowing heads, they managed to outflow pretty much all of the big block Mopar heads. Later iterations of the LS heads managed to flow the earlier 706 heads by an extensive amount, sometimes even in the range of 40 to 80 CFM, which is a huge range. On average, the 706 head tends to flow an average of 10 to 20 CFM throughout the entire lift range. One key note is that 706 heads can flow all the way up to 600 thousandths of lift without having to modify the head at all. On a big block Mopar head, the highest I've been able to see with stock components has been about 0.510. And because the LS can outflow the big block Mopar with smaller valve train components, it tends to have a higher, safer redline as well. One special note about the early LS heads was that if you were to take a standard LS1 or a 6-liter LS and you were to put on a set of 4.8 or 5.3 heads, you would actually gain power at the dyno, and a lot of that has to do with compression ratio. I mentioned in my previous video that the 440 head actually had an open chamber design, which is to say that the quench area, quote unquote, is actually recessed about 100 thousandths, which drops down the stock compression ratio of a motorhome 440 down to about 7.5 to 1. If you were to use a newer composite style gasket, that would drop down your compression ratio to about 7.4 to 1. The chamber on the 452 measures in on an average of 90 cc's, with some even stating that they've been able to measure 96 cc's out of the stock head, versus the LS head that has a chamber size of about 62 cc's. When we looked at the earlier 361 heads, they had an average of about 80 cc's, and the Stealth heads have about an 85 cc's, which would put that in between the 361 and the 440 heads, but nowhere near the range of the LS heads. Even with the stage 3 port job on a stock 440 head, it can barely match the flow numbers of an LS head. I've taken these numbers from Hughes Engine, and as you guys can see, you get very close to an LS head, but that's after a quote-unquote stage 3 valve job. The LS head has a chamber design very similar to the early Mopar heads. Because of the gas crisis in the late 60s and early 70s, manufacturers had to drop the compression ratio because they thought that it would make engines run safer on 87 octane, where the smog area equipment actually made less power and less gas mileage than the earlier stuff, and much less gas mileage than the later stuff that came afterward. In the late 90s, when GM developed their Vortec head, they switched over to metric sizing everything. Everything from the piston rings to the valve stems was then measured in metric sizes. So instead of seeing a 1/16th, 1/16th, 1/8, you started to see everything become a lot smaller when they switched over to metric. GM took the knowledge that they gained from making the Vortec heads and then applied it to the aluminum LS heads or the later model Vortec heads. I have these heads side by side now, and one obvious difference you're going to be able to tell is the actual height of these heads. Although the Mopar heads beats out the LS head by almost 2 inches, the LS head is over 1 inch taller than the Mopar head. And although it doesn't seem like a really big deal, when we look at these ports, you guys will understand why GM decided to make these so tall. First up is the Mopar head. You can usually judge a port job based on how well you can see through the other side of the port. As you guys can tell, you have pretty much a straight shot all the way into the combustion chamber. I'm going to take this welding rod, and you can tell that I can move all the way to the top of the port, all the way to the bottom port, up and down, no problem. Side to side is a little bit more of a challenge because I actually have to have the rod at a very particular angle in order to reach it. If we measure the distance between the valve seat all the way to the back part of the bowl, we're going to be measuring 1.7 inches roughly, which is not too bad. It does change a little bit, but that seems to be the deepest part. If we look at the exhaust valve, it's a different story. It's probably closer to 1.5, maybe even 1.4 inches, even at the deepest part. If we look at the exhaust port itself on the Mopar head, you can see that you had a very, very clean shot to the combustion chamber, whereas the intake had a little bit harder time seeing all the way through. The exhaust side has a pretty easy time doing it. If we go ahead and check to see how well I can touch all sides of the valve seat, it looks like I don't really have resistance when it comes to the exhaust side, which tells me that the exhaust ports actually flow really well despite their size. When we look over the LS head and we look inside the intake valve, you can actually see all the way through just like you could on the exhaust valve on the Mopar head, which tells you this has a much straighter shot when compared to the Mopar head. If we go ahead and take the same welding rod and stick it through, you can see that I can easily touch all sides of the valves, which lets me know that we will have decent flow through this head because it's pretty much a straight shot. When people home port the LS heads, they don't tend to touch the port at all. What they do is that they actually do a lot of bowl work. If we go ahead and compare the port depth between the LS head and the Mopar head, you're going to see that the LS head is over 1 inch deeper on the intake valve and probably almost 1.5 inches on the exhaust valve. Speaking of the exhaust valve, let's go ahead and take a look at that real quick. And as you guys can see, just like the Mopar head, you have a very clean shot out of the exhaust. Usually when people are home porting the LS heads, the exhaust is where they're actually working. When porting the LS heads, they tend to actually raise the roof. They do not touch the floor because they want the exhaust to go out straight. Maybe someday I'll have a chance to compare the LS heads and the 440 heads to the later model Hemi heads. But for now, that's all I have for you guys, so I'll see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher out.